Hello guys, welcome to another lecture. In this lecture I'll be talking about global markets in action. So what I'll be covering is basically exports, imports, tariffs, subsidies and quotas. So these are the five major topics that I'll be covering. So the central theme around this chapter is who wins and who loses from globalization. So you can think of it as a zero-sum game. International trade can be thought of as a zero-sum game. So there are winners and there are losers. So sometimes in the case of exports and imports, even in a domestic economy, the producers are considered the winners and the consumers are considered the losers, but in other cases it's the other way around. The consumers are considered the winners and the producers are considered the losers. So we will also take a look at that question and try to answer it as well as we can. So the chapter checklist is as follows. I will be explaining how markets work with international trade, what is the motivation behind international trade, comparative advantage and all. I will also identify the gains from international trade and its winners and losers. Like I just mentioned, sometimes producers are the winners, sometimes consumers are the winners. I will also explain the effects of international trade barriers such as quotas, tariffs, and also you can think of them as the opposites of barriers such as subsidies. And I will also explain and evaluate arguments used to justify restricting international trade. So how do global markets work? What are imports and what are exports? Imports are the goods and services that people and firms in one country buy from firms in other countries. So any good or service coming into US would be considered, from other country would be considered a US import. So obviously it will also be characterized as the export from the countries where that good or service is coming from. So exports are the goods and services firms in one country sell to people and firms in other countries. So whatever good and service is leaving US is being traded away to another country can be characterized as a US export. So global exports should always equal global imports. That's because what is import for me will be an export for the other person or the other country. So if you add up all the global exports and all the global imports, they should be equal to each other. So what is the motivation behind international trade? So we have already discussed the concept of comparative advantage in one of our earlier lectures. So that is the basis for international trade. You figure out you have a comparative advantage in the production of one good or service, and then you do specialization in the production of that good or service, and that's when you will have to trade that good and service with another country, so you can get some other good or service in which you don't have a comparative advantage in. And the basis for comparative advantage is the differences in opportunity costs in the production of goods and services between countries. So national comparative advantage is the ability of a nation to perform an activity or produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than any other nation. So that is what we defined earlier when we were looking at individual comparative advantage. So national comparative advantage can be scaled to the national level, and if your opportunity cost of producing a good or service is the lowest from all the other countries, it can be said that you have a comparative advantage in the production of that good or service. So for example, the opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is lower in China than in the United States. So it would mean that China has a comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. On the other hand, the opportunity cost of producing an airplane is lower in the United States than in China. So the US has a comparative advantage in producing airplanes. So if both countries specialize in the good in which they have a comparative advantage, and then they trade that good in exchange for the other, they will be better off because they will be reaping the benefits of international trade and also reaping the benefits of a lower opportunity cost as far as the production of the good that they are producing is concerned. So why does the United States import t-shirts? So this figure shows the US demand and US supply of t-shirts. So in this figure there is no supply from outside, meaning there are no imports in this figure so far. So what we have is that we have the US demand and US supply being equal to each other at this equilibrium, where the price of the t-shirt becomes $8 and the quantity demanded and quantity supplied, which are equal to each other, are 40 million t-shirts per year. So what it essentially means is that US firms are producing 40 million t-shirts a year and US consumers are buying 40 million t-shirts a year. Now think of a situation in which international trade is allowed and US producers have to compete with producers from other countries like China, and China has a comparative advantage in the production of t-shirts. So what it would simply mean is that since China has a comparative advantage in the production of t-shirts, the global price or the world price of t-shirts would be lower than the domestic price of 8, and it's actually equal to 5. So this world price is shown by this red line over here, which is equal to a price of $5 per t-shirt. So the world price is less than $8 as the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. So the price in the US will also have to fall to $5 a t-shirt in order to compete with the global producers. And when that happens, Americans will increase the quantity they buy to 60 million t-shirts a year, and you can see that on the demand curve at a price of 5. So US consumers will actually move from consuming only 40 million t-shirts a year to 60 million t-shirts a year, because they can actually get them at a cheaper rate of $5 per t-shirt. On the other hand, US garment makers will have to decrease the quantity they produce from 40 million to 20 million t-shirts, because we know that the quantity supplied decreases with the price, because the motivation of getting a higher price for the product is gone, which means that there is less motivation to supply, so the quantity supplied will decrease. Now what we can see simply over here is that quantity demanded is higher than quantity supplied, and this is the case for domestic quantity demanded and domestic quantity supplied. So what is the difference between the domestic quantity demanded and domestic quantity supplied? It's 60 minus 20, meaning 40 million t-shirts a year. So this simply means that this shortage in the this excess demand has to be fulfilled through imports from other countries. So 40 million t-shirts a year is the imports coming into US from other countries. Now we can pretty much do the same kind of example in the case of exports. So this figure, the question is that why does the US exports airplanes? So this figure shows the domestic supply and demand of airplanes, and we can see that the US domestic quantity demanded and quantity supplied will be equal to each other. It will be 400 airplanes per year at a price of $100 million per airplane. Now what will happen if international trade is allowed, and we are supposing over here that the US has a comparative advantage in the production of airplanes. So comparative advantage in this sense means that the global price will be higher than the domestic price of $100 million per airplane, and in fact it is equal to $150 million per airplane. So US can take advantage of this higher global price than the domestic price, and that is the advantage that they are looking for when they're talking about comparative advantage. And when they sell the product at this higher price, they can actually export some airplanes. So how does that happen? So the price of an airplane in the United States rises to 150 million per airplane, and with that the US aircraft makers increase the quantity they produce to 700 airplanes a year from the initial 400 airplanes per year, because we know that with the increased price there is greater incentive to supply, so that's why the quantity supplied will increase. On the other hand, the quantity demanded will actually decrease from 400 airplanes per year to only 200 airplanes per year, and that is simply because, once again, the quantity demanded always decreases whenever there is an increase in price. So in this scenario, we can see at this line of $150 million per airplane that there is actually an excess supply. There is a surplus of airplanes. So what this simply means is that, first of all, you have to see how much the surplus is. The surplus is the quantity supplied, 700 airplanes, minus the quantity demanded, 200 airplanes. So the excess supply is equal to 500 airplanes, which simply means that since US has a comparative advantage in the production of airplanes, they can export these 500 airplanes a year to other countries. So the winners, losers, and net gains from trade. So let's take a look at that. International trade lowers the price of an imported good and raises the price of an exported good. So what that simply means is that buyers of imported goods benefit from lower prices and sellers of exported goods benefit from higher prices. So in a sense, in the example of t-shirts, we can see that since US does not have a comparative advantage in the production of t-shirts and they have to import t-shirts from China, the US consumers are actually benefiting because they actually have to pay a lower price per t-shirt. On the other hand, in the case of airplanes, the US producers are benefiting because they can actually take advantage of higher prices of airplanes in the global market. So when they export the airplanes, they are the winners. Some people complain about international competition because not everyone wins. So we have already seen that in the case of imports, the domestic consumers will win, while the domestic producers will lose. But in the case of exports, the domestic producers will win, but the domestic consumers will lose. So they are the winners, and so obviously there will always be some winners and some losers from international trade. And what is export for us would be import for another country. So you can think of the impact on the producers and consumers in the other country as well when they engage in international trade. So we measure the gains and losses by examining the effects of international trade on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So we have already established that this is the mechanism of looking at surplus and consumer and producer surplus to be more specific in order to see who is actually winning post-trade and who is losing post-trade. So coming back to the example of imports of t-shirts, with no international trade, the price of a t-shirt in US is $8, and the quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to each other, which is 40 million t-shirts per year. So the consumer surplus, which is the area below the demand curve and above the market price, is this triangle area, while the producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. So the total consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized, and consumer surplus plus producer surplus is equal to total surplus. Now how will things change when we actually engage in international trade. So first of all, what will happen is that the price will fall to $5 per t-shirt. What this means is that the US consumers will extract a greater area of the total surplus, and that is simply because the consumers can take advantage of this lower price of 5 compared to the price of 8 without international trade. So the consumer surplus expands to A, B, and D, the areas A, B, and D, and that is simply because now the consumer surplus can be extracted up till this price of 5, from here to this point on the demand curve. Now, the domestic producers are the losers in this scenario, because now they have to compete with a lower global price, and that is why the producer surplus can only be extracted now up to this price of 5 rather than the price of 8 before, and that's why the producer surplus shrinks to this area C. So the area D was previously not part of the total surplus. So the total surplus previously without international trade was equal to the areas A, B, and C. So area D then is the increase in total surplus that countries are gaining because of international trade. Now this is very important. This actually shows that you can actually increase your total surplus when you engage in international trade. So even taking into account the fact that there are winners and losers in international trade, the more important fact is that the total surplus increases from when you don't engage in international trade. To summarize all this, consumers gain because they pay less per t-shirt, producers lose because they receive a lower price per t-shirt, but the consumer's gain exceeds the producer's loss. If you add up the consumer surplus, A plus B plus D minus the producer's loss, which is B, then the consumer's gain is actually higher than the producer's loss. Now we will take a look at the gains and losses from exports. So going back to the example of airplanes, if there is no international trade, the quantity supplied of airplanes is the domestic quantity supply will be equal to the domestic quantity demanded, equal to 400 airplanes per year at a price of $100 million per airplane. Consumer surplus will be this area below the demand curve and above the market price. Producer surplus will be the area below the market price and above the supply curve. So that the total surplus is maximized, consumer and producer surplus are maximized. But with international trade, the US producers can take advantage of this higher global price, take advantage of their comparative advantage in the production of airplanes, which would mean that the producer surplus can now be extracted not only up to the price of $100 million per airplane, but to a price of $150 million per airplane, which means that the producer surplus expands to C plus B plus D. While on the other hand, the consumer surplus shrinks to only this area A, because consumers now have to, even domestic consumers now have to pay a higher price of $150 million per airplane rather than a lower price of $100 million per airplane. So the area B, this area B is transferred from consumers to producers, while this area D is the increase in total surplus. This was not part of the total surplus before without international trade, and this is the area that the US gains from international trade. Now once again, to summarize all of this, consumers lose because they pay a higher price, producers gain because they receive a higher price. but the producer's gain exceeds the consumer's loss. So the total surplus increases by this area D, and that is the advantage of engaging in international trade, because the US producers are taking advantage of the fact that they have a comparative advantage in the production of airplanes, and they are selling it at a higher price, which is a price higher than the domestic price. So now we will take a look at some of the international trade restrictions which are more commonly used when it comes to international trade. So the four set of tools which are most commonly used are tariffs, import quotas, then there are other kinds of import restrictions that we will take a look at, and finally there's export subsidies. So first we will take a look at the case of tariffs. So a tariff is a tax on a good that is imposed by the importing country when an imported good crosses its international boundary. So it's like if the Chinese t-shirts are coming in at a price of $5 per t-shirt, the US can import some tariff on that t-shirt and increase the domestic price to a higher price than the global price of t-shirts. So for example, another example might be the government of India imposes 100% tariff on wine imported from California. So that simply would mean is that when an Indian wine merchant imports a $10 bottle of Californian wine, he would pay the Indian government $10 import duty. So it's like a tax which is equal to the price, because in this scenario at least the tariff is 100%. So on a $10 bottle of Californian wine, the import duty will be $10. So what will be the effect of a tariff? So with free international trade, the world price of a t-shirt is $5, for example, and the United States imports 40 million t-shirts a year. This is just referencing to the earlier example. So imagine that the US imposes a tariff of $2 on each t-shirt, then the price of a t-shirt in the United States will increase by $2, meaning it will go up from 5 to 5 plus 2, which is 7. So this next figure will basically explain how the imposition of tariff will affect the international trade post-tariff. So the price of a t-shirt in the case of without having a tariff would be equal to the world price or the global price of $5 per t-shirt. And in this scenario, the United States will import 40 million t-shirts, because there is the gap between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied at this price of $5 per t-shirt. So 60 minus 20 is equal to 40 million t-shirts, and that is the imports of t-shirts coming into US. Now let's suppose that the US government imposes a tariff of $2 per t-shirt, which will raise the price of t-shirts from $5 to $7. So this new red line of $7 shows the price post-tariff. This simply means that the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, the domestic quantity supplied and the domestic quantity demanded, becomes smaller now. So the difference is 45 minus 35 million t-shirts, meaning only 10 million t-shirts a year. So the imports coming into US will now be only 10 million t-shirts a year rather than this previous gap of 40 million t-shirts a year. So the most important thing to look at over here is that this imposition of tariff has actually achieved its goal of restricting the imports of t-shirts from other countries. So in a sense, why would we do that? Why would the government actually be doing that? So they're trying to protect the domestic producer, and that is why they're trying to do that. So in order to protect the domestic garment manufacturers, you are artificially increasing the price of t-shirts within US so that the domestic producers can compete with the international imports coming into US. And also with the imposition of this tariff, the US government collects the tax revenue of 20 million a year, and that is simply shown by this imports over here. Imports are 10 million t-shirts per year, and the duty collected on all of these 10 million t-shirts is $2 per t-shirt. So $2 per t-shirt multiplied by 10 million t-shirts gives us the total tax revenue, which is $20 million a year, and it's also shown by this area of the square over here. So let's take a look at the winners, losers, and the social loss from a tariff. So obviously any sort of government intervention, as we have seen previously, results in inefficiency in the market. So let's take a look at the situation now with the imposition of tariff. So US producers of t-shirts gain because they can now compete better with international producers, while US consumers of t-shirts lose. So previously the consumers, when they were higher imports, they were taking advantage of the lower global price, and they were taking advantage of higher number of imports coming into the US. But now they lose because the imports have shrunk, and also the domestic price has actually increased from $5 to $7. The US consumers lose more than US producers gain. So US producers of t-shirts will gain because US garment makers can now sell t-shirts for a higher price. The marginal cost of producing a t-shirt is less than the higher price, so the producer surplus increases, and the increased producer surplus is the gain to US garment makers. And on the other hand, the US consumers lose because now they have to pay a higher price. The number of imports of t-shirts have also decreased. So which changes by more? Is it the consumer surplus decrease, or is it the producer surplus increase? So that is what we will take a look at in the next slide. So this is the graph for including international trade when there is no tariff. So the consumer surplus is this area above the price of 5 and below the demand curve, while the producer surplus is this area which is below the market price but above the supply curve. So this triangle area, remember that this is the area of surplus, which is because of the gain from free trade. So if a $2 tariff is added to the world price and the US price increases to $7, let's see how that will change the producer and consumer surplus. So the quantity of t-shirts produced in the United States will increase from this point to this point, and quantity demanded of t-shirts will actually decrease in the United States from this point to this point. So the imports will also decrease because previously this was the gap which was covered by imports in the demand. Now the excess demand has shrunk to only this gap, and now only this gap is covered by imports from other countries. So the consumers are losing, and that makes intuitive sense to get the consumer surplus decreased, and the consumer surplus will decrease because previously the consumer surplus was being extracted up to this lower price of 5. Now it can only be extracted up to this higher price of 7. So this area becomes the consumer surplus. On the other hand, the producer surplus actually increases. So now this area B is also part of the producer surplus. So now the producers can extract a surplus up to this higher price. So area B is a transfer from consumer surplus to producer surplus. Now what happens to the area which was previously shown as the gain from international trade? This area, this triangle is the area that I am talking about. So now the tariff revenue, which is the area C of this square over here, now this is no longer part of the consumer or the producer surplus because this tariff revenue goes to the government, which is collecting the import duty. On the other hand, this area D on both sides of C, this triangle area D on both sides of D becomes the deadweight loss, because previously this was part of the consumer surplus. Now this is just a waste of surplus, so this is going to neither the producers nor the consumers. This becomes the deadweight loss. So we can actually see that previously, when we were actually gaining from international trade with this sort of government intervention like a tariff, we are actually losing some part of the total surplus which we had before. So now we'll move on to the case of import quotas. An import quota is a quantitative restriction rather than a price restriction, which is the case for tariff. And this is a restriction on the import of a good that limits the maximum quantity of a good that may be imported in a given time period. So what will be the effect of an import quota? So with free international trade, the world price of a t-shirt was $5 per t-shirt in the United States, and it was importing 40 million t-shirts a year. This is referencing the earlier example. So let's suppose the US imposes a quota of 10 million on imported t-shirts, which means that no more than 10 million t-shirts can now be imported into the US. So let's see the effect of this kind of a government intervention on this graph. So without any sort of government intervention, the world price of t-shirts was $5, and this gap over here was being fulfilled by imports coming into the US, which was 40 million t-shirts. So now, with the imposition of this quota of 10 million t-shirts, the supply in the US becomes the supply curve, the initial blue supply curve, plus the quota, which is 10 million. So essentially, you can think of the supply increasing by 10 million t-shirts at every price. So what does that mean? It's kind of like adding 10 horizontally to the initial supply curve at all points. So if you add 10 million horizontally, it would mean that, for example, this point will move to this point by 10. So that is where we are at after the imposition of the quota. So the domestic supply increases. So essentially it's like a rightward shift of the supply curve by 10 million from every point on the initial supply curve. What this will mean, however, in terms of price, which is more important, is that the price will increase from $5 to $7, because that is we are getting this from the intersection of this new supply curve and the demand curve, the domestic demand curve. So essentially this SUS plus quota becomes the new US domestic supply, or you can call it the total supply, which includes the domestic the supply from domestic producers, while also the 10 million imports from international producers. And this demand curve is the domestic demand curve, so the intersection of these two will give us the new price. With this higher price, the Americans will decrease the number of t-shirts they buy to 45 million a year. So without the quota, the quantity demanded was 60 million t-shirts a year. Now it will go down to 45 million t-shirts a year, and that's simply because this higher price of 7, the quantity demanded will decrease. On the other hand, US government makers will increase production to 35 million t-shirts a year from their initial supply of 20 million t-shirts a year, because now they have more incentive to supply, because the price has increased from $5 to $7 per t-shirt. So because of this increase in price, the quantity supplied will increase, and this remaining gap between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied will be fulfilled by the 10 million imports. And you can easily see that over here, that the gap between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied is 45 minus 35 million t-shirts, meaning 10 million t-shirts, which is exactly equal to our import quota. So let's take a look at the winners, losers, and the social loss from an import quota. So the US producers of t-shirts will gain, the US consumers of t-shirts will lose, and the importers of t-shirts will also gain, and we will take a look at all three of these scenarios in the next graph. So without any sort of government intervention, any quota, we get this consumer surplus, which is equal to this area of the triangle, which is above the price and below the demand curve. The producer surplus is this area which is below the market price and above the supply curve. And this area of the triangle shows the gains from free trade. So total surplus is maximized. So now with the case of the imposition of the quota, the imports will decrease, and that is the motivation behind having a quota in the first place. The government wants to restrict the imports. They want to protect the domestic producers of t-shirts. And that is because now the domestic producers can compete better, because they can actually compete at a higher price of 7 than this lower price of 5 initially, without any sort of government intervention. So in this scenario, the consumer surplus will shrink, and that makes intuitive sense because the consumers can no longer take advantage of this lower price of 5. Now they have to pay a higher price of 7, so the consumer surplus can only be extracted up to this point. So this area of the triangle becomes the consumer surplus. The producer surplus, on the other hand, increases. So now this area B, which was previously part of the consumer surplus, becomes part of the producer surplus, and simply because the producers can now extract a surplus up to this higher price of 7 rather than this lower price of 5 initially. Now what happens to this area which was the gains from free trade? That becomes an important question. So first of all, this area of the square C becomes the importer's profit, and that is simply because the importers are basically paying $5 for the t-shirts that they are getting from other countries, but they are actually getting a price of $7 per t-shirt inside the US. So the importer's profit has actually increased because they can take advantage of lower prices in the foreign countries and take advantage of higher domestic price in the US of t-shirts. So the $2 that they are getting on every imported t-shirt is their gain, is their profit. So $2 on every t-shirt multiplied by the 10 million t-shirts gives us this area which is equal to the importer's profit. On the other hand, these triangle areas D on both sides of the C, on both sides of the square C, shows us the deadweight loss created by import quota. So why is this the case? It's simply the case because we have seen previously as well that with any sort of government intervention, you always lose some efficiency, which means some of the surplus is actually wasted. And this is the case over here as well. Because and to summarize this, the consumers are losing more than what the producers are gaining, and the deadweight loss arises in the case of quota as well as in the case of tariffs. Now, what are some other import barriers apart from tariffs and quotas? They can be health, safety and regulation barriers. They can also be voluntary export restraints. So, for example, in US, food imports are examined by the FDA to determine whether the food is pure, wholesome, safe to eat, and produced under sanitary conditions. So obviously these kind of restrictions can have the potential of restricting imports from other countries which do not follow these guidelines, which do not meet these standards. On the other hand, what is a voluntary export restraint? It is basically like a quota allocated to a foreign exporter of the good. So, for example, if for every individual foreign exporter, you can say you can only export this amount of a good into US, which will be our import. So voluntary export restraint decreases imports just like a quota, but the foreign exporter gets the profit from the gap between the domestic price and the world price, rather than the domestic importer. So export subsidies are, you can think of export subsidies as a kind of a reverse of a tariff. So a subsidy is a payment made by the government to a producer which encourages or has the potential of encouraging exports. Once again, it's a payment made by the government to a domestic producer of an exported good. Export subsidies will bring gains to domestic producers, but they will result in overproduction in the domestic economy and the underproduction in the rest of the world. Once again, it will create a deadweight loss. So by now, we can just simply say that whenever the government intervenes in the market, there's always some sort of a deadweight loss. So even with the case of export subsidies, there will also be deadweight loss created. And the producers will be gaining more in the case of export subsidies than the consumers. Now this final part of the lecture will take a look at the case against protection. So the governments often make a case for protection, meaning they want to protect the domestic industry, the domestic producers, in the hope that if they restrict or stop imports of certain goods, the local industry will flourish and they can actually become more experienced and become better and more efficient producers, which would make them more competitive in the international market. So the three traditional arguments for protection, or for protecting local industries, are the national security argument, the infant industry argument, and the dumping argument. So what is the national security argument? It's simply that country must protect industries that produce defense equipment and armaments and those on which the defense industries rely for their raw materials and other intermediate inputs. Why is this case made? It's simply because if the worst case scenario is imagined, that there is a war between two countries, you want the industries which will help you in making defense equipment and armaments, which will basically be helpful in winning that war. You want to protect those industries. You want to have those industries which can produce those sort of goods. So that is the argument, but this argument for protection can be taken too far. What does that mean? It simply means that at a time of war, every industry becomes important. Every sort of production becomes important. So how many industries will you extend this argument to? And if you really extend it all the way, it will simply mean that you will not be able to take advantage of international trade at all, and you will have to protect all of your industries. So then again, I mean, this is the case of a value judgment coming in. Will that be a good outcome? Will that be a bad outcome? I mean, economically speaking, it will be a bad outcome because you will not be able to benefit from the gains of international trade. The second argument is the infant industry argument, and the argument goes that it is necessary to protect a new industry from import competition to enable it to grow into a mature industry that can compete in world markets. And this idea is called learning by doing. So you basically learn by observing other countries and also by just doing the process again and again, so that your productivity increases, the productivity of the workers involved in production increases. So learning by doing can be an important tool for productivity growth, but looking at the example of countries like India, who had huge infant industry related protection to domestic industries, we have the example of those of cases in which this sort of protectionism really failed, and India really did not become an economic giant until they actually open up their borders to international trade, and their domestic production actually competed with international production directly. So the dumping argument is another argument against for protection. So the dumping occurs because of two reasons. Dumping simply means that a foreign firm sells its exports at a lower price than its cost of production. It can happen because of two reasons: predatory pricing. So simply because when a firm is trying to drive out the domestic competitor, for example, if a firm in China decides that we want to really drive out the competition in US, they can dump their goods at a lower price than their cost of production in order to drive out the domestic competition in US. A subsidy might be another reason why dumping can happen. So a firm can actually receive a subsidy from a government to export, and they can actually provide their good at a price which is lower than the cost of production. And this is, once again, this can affect the local production within the country in which the export is coming into. So this argument is hard to justify because it is virtually impossible to determine a firm's cost. So you can always find it hard to make this argument because it will be hard to kind of see what the cost of production for any export coming into US is. So given that fact, it's just very impossible to be in favor of this argument. Now these are the traditional arguments made for protection. There are some other newer arguments for protection which we will discuss in the next slides. So the first one is that it saves jobs. So the idea is that the buying foreign goods costs domestic jobs, and free trade will actually destroy jobs in the local economy. In the case of US, it will destroy jobs in the US. However, this is not entirely true because free trade will destroy some jobs, that is true, but it will also create other jobs. Because when you are no longer competitive in the production of a good or service, you will be better off by importing that good or service, and then that segment of the population, that labor, can actually move to the production of the goods and services in which you have a comparative advantage in. So for example, US has been moving more and more towards the production of higher technologically advanced goods and services, and that is what the labor force can move into. So it will create some jobs while it will destroy other jobs. And protection to save particular jobs is also very costly. We have seen that in the case of the textile industry in the US, which was protected for a number of years, but it was actually very costly to protect them, to protect the workers in those industries. It was costing the taxpayers a lot of money. Now another case for protection is that it allows us to compete with cheap foreign labor. So the idea is that the high-wage country cannot compete with the low-wage country, but that idea might be faulty because a low-wage labor might be less productive than the high-wage labor. So once again, we will have to go back to the demand and supply of labor. So why is the wage low in some countries? It's simply because the productivity in those countries is lower. So if someone is getting a higher wage in US, it simply means that the productivity in US might be higher. So in that scenario, it simply will not be the case that a low wage country would always be at an advantage, because the high wage country might have higher productivity workers. Another argument for protection is that it brings diversity and stability. So a diversified investment portfolio is less risky than one that has all of its eggs in one basket. So which simply means that a diversified economy will fluctuate less than an economy that produces only one or two goods. So if you are protecting only one or two industries, you are not really taking advantage of diversification, which simply means that if a financial crash happens, you will probably suffer more than other countries who have a diversified investment portfolio. The final argument for protection is that it penalizes like free trade penalizes lax environmental standards. So this idea is that protection might be good for the environment, because free trade would allow countries to increase exports if they have lower environmental standards. For example, a lot of fuss is made in the case of China that since China has lower human rights standards, has lower environmental standards, they can actually produce less cost goods at a lower cost, which makes them artificially more competitive in the global economy than countries such as US, who have better human rights laws and better environmental standards. But the argument against this kind of a logic would be that if China actually exports more, their incomes might increase more, which will give them actually more financial leverage to engage in environmental, in higher environmental standards. So this argument also has some loopholes. So why is international trade restricted? So we have already seen that with trade restrictions, the producers benefit more than the consumers. So rent seeking plays a very important part into why international trade is restricted, because governments are always looking to restrict international trade by imposing quotas or tariffs. And rent seeking is simply the lobbying and other political activity that seeks to capture the gains from trade. So why is this the case? It's simply because millions of consumers actually lose because of when they don't take part, when the economy does not take advantage of free trade, while on the other hand, few producers actually gain a lot. And why is this the case? It's simply because overall the producers are way less than consumers. So consumers, even if they lose, that loss might be divided over a higher number of consumers. On the other hand, producers, when they are gaining, while the government is protecting them, or while the government is imposing policies such as tariffs or quotas, the gains of that protection is divided over a smaller number of producers. So because the gain from a tariff is large, the producers have a strong incentive to incur the expense of lobbying for a tariff and against free trade. On the other hand, each consumer's loss when the economy is protecting is small. So consumers have little incentive to organize and incur the expense of lobbying for free trade. So each group, consumers and producers, are basically weighing their benefits against costs, and they're choosing the best action for themselves. So the best action for producers becomes that they want to lobby for protectionism, because the gains that they are gaining will be higher per producer. On the other hand, consumers, there's way more consumers than producers, so whatever loss they will be incurring because of protection will actually be very lower on a per consumer level. So who wins and who loses from globalization? They are both winners and losers. We've already looked at that. In some cases, consumers are winning. In some other cases, producers are winning. US consumer is a big winner in the case of globalization, because goods and services such as iPads, Nike shoes, and all of these other consumer goods are available at cheaper and lower prices than ever before. Now, obviously, there might be other winners in other countries as well. So because of these cheap goods are coming into US, the manufacturers or the workers who are making those goods, for example, in India and in China and in other Asian countries from where these cheaper goods are coming from, those workers are also big winners. And why are they big winners? Because previously, when those workers might not have an opportunity to actually work in such industries, now they have that opportunity. Now they have more and better, higher wages and better living conditions as a result of that. The US textile workers, for example, and furniture makers might be big losers in this case. And that is simply because the US textile industry and furniture industry can no longer compete with the global textile and furniture makers. So a lot of jobs in the textile sector and the furniture sector have been lost in the US, and so those workers can be thought of as losers from globalization. And finally, one of the biggest losers are African farmers, because they are blocked by global food markets because of trade restrictions, and also because of subsidies that the US government provides to US farmers. And also the European farmers get the same sort of subsidies. So globalization is basically having a very bad effect on African farmers, and this is really important because for most of African countries, they primarily are relying on their agricultural output, because that is their biggest source of industry. That is where most of the workers are working. So if they cannot take advantage of globalization, it means that African farmers might be lagging behind the rest of the world, and in that scenario, Africa on the whole might also be lagging behind the rest of the world. So this is the end of the lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys had a good time learning about exports, imports, tariffs, quotas, subsidies, etc. And if you let me know how you like the video, and take care. And thanks for watching.